Good afternoon. My name is Enrique Desmond-Arias. I am the Marxe Chair for Western Hemisphere Affairs here at the Marxe School at Baruch College. Our event this afternoon is entitled Transitional Justice in Latin America Today. Our roundtable is being moderated by Stephanie Golub. Professor Golub is Chair of the Department of Political Science and an associate professor at Baruch College as a graduate student, where she teaches courses on globalization, Latin American politics, and international law. She also serves as the founding director of ISLA, the initiative for the study of Latin America, based at Baruch's Weissman School of Arts and Sciences. Her scholarship on the globalization of justice, with a focus on Chile and Spain, has been awarded the Andrew W. Mellon Residential Fellowship at the Center for the Humanities at the CUNY Graduate Center and the Frank Cass Prize from the Journal of Democratization. Most recently, she has been a member of an international research team based at the Spanish National Research Council, studying the legal and political impacts of post-atrocity mass grave exhumations in comparative perspective. We are privileged to have joining us for our roundtable today two distinguished experts in this field. The first is Jo Marie Burt, an associate professor of political science at the Schar School of Public and of Policy and Government at George Mason University. She is also senior fellow at the Washington Office on Latin America, a leading human rights research and advocacy organization, and co-director of the trial monitoring project Verdad y Justicia in Guatemala. She is the author of numerous books and scholarly articles on political violence, human rights, and transitional justice in post-conflict societies. Most recently, Transitional Justice in the Aftermath of Civil Conflict, Lessons from Peru, Guatemala, and El Salvador. Dr. Burt was a member of the research team of the Peruvian Truth and Reconciliation Commission and an international observer at the human rights trial of former Peruvian President Alberto Fujimori and the genocide trial of former Guatemalan dictator Efraín Ríos Montt. She is completing a manuscript entitled "We Only Want to Be Human: Victims in Pursuit of Justice in Post-War Guatemala." Jorge Peniche is co-founder and director of JTMX, Transitional Justice in Mexico, a think and do tank that advocates for using a transitional justice perspective to provide redress for the gross human rights violations and the impunity crisis in the so-called war on drugs. Mr. Peniche currently serves as JTMX's Director of Knowledge Production, where he implements innovative documentation techniques and cutting-edge analysis, focusing on assisting and working with local grassroots demands in order to provide in-depth explanations of the nuances of diverse Mexican contexts and serve as inputs for future litigation and institutional reform. Mr. Peniche holds a Master of Laws degree from New York University, where he was a human rights and transitional justice scholar. His expertise lies at the crossroads between legal theory, state building, rule of law, and transitional justice. He previously served as a consultant to the former United Nations Special Rapporteur on Transitional Justice, Mr. Pablo de Grief, and under the International Prosecutor for the Extraordinary Chambers in the Court of Cambodia. In Mexico, Mr. Peniche has also led litigation teams in landmark cases adjudicated before the Supreme Court, including, among others, the legislative branch's claim against the last presidential deployment of the military to perform law enforcement duties and strategic cases brought to challenge the drug prohibition regime. He has published on the role of constitutional courts in times of transition, the legacy of the Mexican experience in using transitional justice for its authoritarian past, and the evolution of the transitional justice framework to discuss whether it could serve contexts like Mexico's. As a special reminder to everyone, we are recording this event. The event will be posted for viewing afterwards. We will take approximately the first 45 minutes or so for the roundtable portion of the event, after which we will take questions from the audience in the question and answer section of this meeting. If you have questions, please submit those questions to the chat box. Thank you very much. And I turn it over to you, Professor Gull.
Thank you so much. It's really a great pleasure for me to be here. ISLA is delighted to partner with Marxe on this event today. I want to thank our guest speakers, and I want to thank all of you for joining us for this important conversation. I'm going to start off with a bit of context in terms of what our topic is today. So since the 1970s, when the region joined the third wave of democratization following a period of authoritarianism and civil war, Latin America has served as a veritable laboratory for experiments in transitional justice, which many of us refer to as TJ, defined as the judicial and non-judicial mechanisms put in place to provide accountability for past atrocity crimes. National trials, international criminal tribunals, lustration, truth commissions, reparations, memorials and sites of memory, reform of school curricula, and more often than not, some form of amnesty have all been tried across a wide variety of national contexts. So on the one hand, many scholars justifiably praise Latin American TJ innovations, in particular, their impact on a justice cascade that propagated anti-impunity norms around the world. And yet today, nearly half a century later, Latin America continues to lead in the other direction, with atrocity crimes still unpunished and impunity corroding public trust and undermining those same democracies ostensibly founded on transitions where justice was supposed to have been built in. Well past their transitions then, TJ remains a cuenta pendiente, or an unpaid bill that haunts the region's democracies. Because TJ, with its focus on truth, justice, reparation, and non-repetition, is both backward and forward-looking. How crimes of the past are recognized, investigated, and confronted by the state today will have implications for the state's commitment to rule of law and human rights going forward. So looking at today's ongoing experiments in TJ during this roundtable, we're going to focus on Guatemala and Mexico. And it's my pleasure and honor to be joined by Jo Marie Burt and Jorge Peniche to discuss the state of transitional justice TJ in these countries and the hemisphere more broadly. So welcome to you both. And before we begin our conversation, I just want to encourage all participants, all of you, to put your questions for our speakers into the chat to Mark's Q&A. We'll have a Q&A session, as Professor Arias mentioned, afterwards later on in the meeting. So let me start off with you, Dr. Burt, Jo Marie, your first question. In late January here in the US, we read in the New York Times about the convictions of 5 former paramilitary members on charges of crimes against humanity for rape and sexual violence against 36 Maya Achi women during Guatemala's civil war, around 1981 to 85. So I'd like you to start us off telling us a bit about this trial. You're a very well-known expert on trials, on human rights trials. What has this trial accomplished that others before it had not? There had been many other trials in Guatemala. And what TJ issues has it not resolved?
Wow, that's a great question, Stephanie. So first, let me say thank you to you and Desmond for the invitation to be here. It's nice to see Jorge as well. I would say the first response to your question is that this is one of the few times that survivors of wartime rape have succeeded in charging and convicting their perpetrators, the perpetrators of sexual violence against them during war. In Guatemala, it's only the second time a case of wartime sexual violence against indigenous women has come to trial, and only the third sentence of sexual violence during the war. The first was the landmark Sepulsarco trial in 2016, which I also have observed and written about, in which 15 Kekchi women won a conviction against a former military officer and a former military commissioner for systematically raping them, and also for subjecting them to a system of sexual and domestic slavery over a period of several years in the Sepulsarco military detachment. In 2018, 4 senior military officials were convicted of torture and sexual violence against Emma Molina Tyson, who at the time was a political activist. She was only 21 years old, and for the forced disappearance of her brother in reprisal for Emma's escape and their inability to capture her. Her brother remains missing. Emma is now living in exile in Costa Rica. And so there's a clear demonstration effect here, right? In the case of the Molina Tyson conviction, Emma told me that the Seporsarco trial before her inspired her to bring her case to trial. She was only focused on her brother's disappearance. And she decided that she did want to pursue justice against those who perpetrated sexual abuse against her. And not only the direct perpetrators, but the intellectual authors as well. So the trial that happened in January, the Maya Achi sexual violence trial, is one in a chain of trials that have demonstrated, I believe, quite clearly that the Guatemalan army carried out a systematic plan of using rape as a weapon of war. And it also shows that women can break the silence that often obscures wartime rape and rape in general, right? It's very difficult for women to come forward in cases of rape in times of peace or war. Break the silence, leave behind the shame that they felt for years after being raped. Many women survivors who experience these criminal prosecutions talk about literally giving the shame that they've carried all these years back to the individuals who carried out the actual atrocities. And I think this demonstration effect to survivors of rape in times of war and in times of peace, that they're not responsible for what happened to them and that they have the right to seek justice. Another, I think, important lesson from this case is that the court granted the women integral reparations, as they did in the Seporsarco case, including not only economic reparations, but also health, psychological care, educational scholarships for their children and grandchildren, as a way to help compensate the women for the terrible sort of emotional as well as physical damage that they've suffered for so many years. That on the individual level. I also think trials like this one are a victory, or not a victory, that's the wrong word, are important for rewriting how Guatemalans understand the conflict. And so they're important for historical memory. The trial revealed, like the Seporsarco trial before it, that wartime sexual violence is not an isolated act, but rather an integral part of the Guatemalan army's counterinsurgency strategy. As I said a moment ago, rape was used as a weapon of war, just like a bullet or a bomb. The Guatemalan army and their paramilitary proxies deployed sexual violence to control women's bodies and to subjugate not only them, but their entire community, in this case, the Achi community, through terror and violence. I think another thing that was revealed through this and the Seporsarco trial is that the violence exercised by the Guatemalan army, though it, in principle, it was directed towards combating insurgent movements, and there were in fact insurgent movements in Guatemala at the time in the 1980s. But oftentimes the army's actions had not military, but actually economic objectives or political objectives. So in the Seporsarco case, it became very clear through the course of the trial that in the area of Rabinal, where these abuses took place, where these women were raped and subjected to sexual and domestic servitude, there was actually no guerrilla presence at all. Local landowners called in the military because they wanted to get rid of the community leaders in Seporsarco, who they claimed were guerrillas, but who were in fact really only seeking to recover lands that had been stolen from the Quechua communities over several decades. And in this case, the Maya Achi case, which is part of a much larger series of cases, which have some of which have come to trial, Rio Negro, but others that have not, like Plan de Sanchez. The army literally removed displaced indigenous communities in Rabinal who were opposing the construction of the Chicxoy Dam. This was in the early 1980s. It was a development project funded by the World Bank, the Inter-American Development Bank, and elements of the United States government. And the Guatemalan army carried out a sequence of massacres against Maya Achi communities, killing hundreds of people, displacing thousands of people, and incurring the rape of dozens, if not more, of Achi women and girls. So we see that sometimes violence, so it takes place in the context of an internal armed conflict, its intentions may not necessarily be military, but other. And I think another thing that they show is that through a public trial, through airing out this history, younger generations who did not live through the conflict have an opportunity to learn about what really happened in Guatemala, and counter some of the still very predominant official narratives that deny state or military involvement in any human rights abuses. That all said, trials have inherent limitations, right? First and foremost, trials, no TJ mechanism really can ever fully repair the harm done. An individual who's been disappeared or killed, or a woman who's been, or a girl who's been raped, that harm is never repaired fully, right? So that has to be held up first and foremost. But the fact that victims seek out trials, that they want justice, not all victims, and I think it's important to say that, not all victims want justice, but many do. And I think that's important to keep in mind. Another limitation in this particular case is that the conviction was handed down against the direct perpetrators. In other words, the men who literally raped the victims, the survivors, I should say. The intellectual authors have not yet been held to account, although the court in its ruling called on the Attorney General's office to further investigate in order to be able to bring intellectual authors to account. Now, in other cases, such as the genocide trial in Guatemala, intellectual, or the Molina Tyson case, intellectual authors have been held to account, but it's a very difficult proposition in a place like Guatemala, where powerful military officials from the past continue to have a lot of power. That's something I could talk about maybe later. And another problem is that trials like this one require prosecutorial and judicial independence. And building prosecutorial and judicial independence in post-conflict societies is extremely difficult. And Guatemala is a really good case study of this, right? Where for years after the war ended and peace accords were signed, there was, a few efforts to prosecute human rights abuses, and yet they were not satisfactory in any way, really, the few cases that came to court. And there was, in fact, a de facto impunity for these crimes. And it's not until you begin to see changes in the Attorney General's office, in the judiciary, which is the result of a series of factors, that you start to see a real push towards bringing these kinds of cases to trial. And that said, Guatemala has there's only been convictions in 21 cases. Representing, thousands of victims in some instances. The genocide case was almost 2,000 victims, for example. But recall that the Guatemalan civil conflict involved 200,000 victims, according to the Commission for Historical Clarification. So it still is a small number of victims whose cases are represented in these kinds of trials. And oftentimes you have reversals, and this case is an example of that. So first of all, it took a long time for the case to come to court in the first place. It wasn't until 2000, the events happened in the early 1980s, the crimes against these women. And they didn't decide to bring a case until 2011 in the context of other efforts to investigate other crimes, including massacres and forced disappearances against the Maya Achi population. It took another 7 years for the first arrest to happen in this case. That was in 2018. And then in 2019, the pretrial judge actually dismissed the charges. And I wrote about this back then thinking, my God, I don't see a way forward for this case. However, the victims were decided to fight back, and they filed a recusal motion against the judge for racially motivated discrimination. Remember, these are Indigenous women, and for failing to take their testimonies into account. The women themselves directly identified their perpetrators. And so eventually the case was handed over to, they won the recusal motion, the case was handed to a new judge. And interesting, here's another little wrinkle in the story where international justice plays a role. One of the men who was a fugitive in the case, who had not been originally arrested in 2018, was deported from the United States. He'd been arrested in the United States, identified by individuals living here, deported back to Guatemala after found, he was found guilty of immigration fraud, lying on his immigration forms and so forth. But he was deported, and that reactivates the case. And the judge was able to bring at least 3 of the men who'd been freed in 2018 to trial in this case. So 5 men, not all of those identified originally, but 5 were brought to trial. And the case was divided. So the original case did in fact involve 36 women. This case only involved 5. So you can see how it's a victory in many ways for the women, for the surviving women. And yet there's a lot that was that occurred along the way to undermine the nature of the case. There's still women who haven't been able to testify in court,
right,
whose perpetrators remain actually free. 3 of the perpetrators remain free and 1 is fugitive. So you can see that it's not a complete, to call it a complete victory would be incorrect.
Right. So this is, from what I'm hearing, it's like I sort of whipshaw back and forth to like, this is a huge achievement. There's so much that the consequences of impunity in the 80s are still felt today, right? And that's why this case matters. On the other hand, the trials in some ways are emblematic, right? They are only few people can be the ones who are it can only reach a certain number of victims. I want to bring Jorge in here for a second. Being, from the position in Mexico and hearing about all of these trials, that isn't the experience in Mexico. No. So could you tell us a little bit about what is going on? The most recent high profile news in transitional justice in Mexico is that the president, Andrés Manuel López Obrador, established a sort of truth commission to clarify history, to investigate human rights abuses. But it's really limited to the period of 1965 to 1990. While that is important, and I'd like to hear a little bit about what you think about that, there are also, it excludes the post-2006 moment where we've seen an explosion of violence and impunity for that violence in the era of the war on drugs. So could you give us an idea of like what's going on with JTMX and transitional justice in Mexico?
Thank you so much for the invitation. It's a pleasure to be here with Enrique, Jo Marie, Stephanie. That's a great question, and actually that's what keeps you awake, like on a daily basis. I think we're touching upon the problem, first of all, of why a TJ approach in Mexico, right? Can we talk, and to what extent, of transitional justice in this country? As you have mentioned, TJ emerged as a lab of justice in authoritarian regimes. There, it was exported to post-conflict settings. So Mexico poses a really interesting question in terms of what's happening in this country, right? Could you say Mexico falls within the international humanitarian law regime? Like, are we at war? Leaving aside the term war on drugs, are we like legally at war, right? Or is it rather more public security problem? So I think in that regard, the human rights discourse has probably failed to grasp with what's actually happening in the country. I should emphasize that Mexico actually underwent like a transitional justice process after their democratic transition in 2000, and of course, we can disagree on the quality, on the mechanisms, or its success, right? We had like a special prosecutor's office, we have a national reparations program. Like we have, like if you qualify TJ in terms of the extraordinary mechanism, we have some of them, right? But the thing is, and we actually call it the Mexican solution to transitional justice. That's the name the special prosecutor used, because the mechanism were actually really criticized, and they were not backed by civil society movements, or at least not in a really strong way. Some authors, have actually tried to draw some connections between the fall of the authoritarian regime in 2000 and what we are actually experiencing in terms of the war on drugs. Some say that the mistake on not adopting like lustration programs, for example, or implementing a strong security reform has given us the experts in violence that then were hired by private militias, for example, right? So on the one hand, when we think of TJ in terms of extraordinary mechanism, right? We tend to think on the end of the race, right? Once they are implemented, you are in a different game for sure. But what's happening in Mexico, that we are in a really different situation, because we are in the discussion of, first of all, whether Mexico could benefit from a TJ approach. So if you think it in terms of extraordinary mechanism, which is not my approach, probably you could say, okay, Mexico has a plethora of extraordinary mechanisms currently, right? We have a national commission to search for people. We have an extraordinary mechanism to identify people that have suffered lethal violence, etc., etc., etc. But if you think like on the common line that runs through authoritarian conflict settings, what you have in Mexico, at least to my mind, is that if you want to talk about extraordinary mechanisms, you have to make the case of why the ordinary mechanisms are not working, right? At least as a lawyer, I would say, like, if you want to argue in favor of extraordinary, you have to make a case in departing ordinary, right? Second, in Mexico, like as I mentioned, the human rights discourse has failed to grasp with this idea of we are not in conflict, or we are not in an authoritarian regime. What we are experiencing, and probably like political scientists have made a better effort in trying to characterize this, is like you have really schemes of criminal governance. Like you have like schemes of cooperation, like gray zones, where you don't have like, I mean, you have, of course, parties in opposition, you have like violence, but what you have at the end of the day is like many micro contexts, like local contexts that are characterized by violence, like lethal violence, particularly extortive violence, violence of disappearing as king in these particular regimes, right? So you have like a normal, like a paralegal regime that is characterized by the use of violence in many micro contexts. So building from bottom to top, you will find that the numbers, the staggering numbers, are characterized by this. And by no means I'm saying that there is the presence of the army or there is an excessive use of force. There is, of course. But what you have at the end is that violence has been a part of the story of this country, and this didn't start in 2006. And probably the main problem is that we didn't address, like we didn't use meaningful interventions that could further memory and illustration projects and institutional reforms. Leave aside justice, right? As you mentioned, like if you think in the different experiences in the region, you could name, and Jo Marie probably is better tasked for doing this, but you could name the Pinochet case, right? You can mention Rios Montt case, you can mention Fujimori, you can mention the junta trials in Argentina. We don't have this in Mexico. We don't have this landmark case in terms of impunity, and there has to be an explanation for that. I mean, there are many, and I'm happy to elaborate on that on that realm later on. But the thing is that impunity has been understood as an anomaly to the political system, but it's not. It's part of how the system has worked. And if you think it this way, the system works quite well, right? For some people. So at the end of the day, my point is, like, when you think about TJ, some try to draw a line and they say, I'm actually working on an article on that. Some say, like, in Mexico, you could not introduce TJ because we are talking about, they say economic violence, right? It's violence motivated by a profit motivation, let's say, right? And on the other hand, you have like political violence, right? I will challenge that. Like, there's a huge political component in violence in Mexico. Like, mayors are being killed, journalists are being killed. Like, there is a lot of fight for power in this country. And on the other hand, like, political violence in this conflict, like traditional conflict situations, they have an economic component, right? There is some of that. So I think, like, when you see in practice what is happening, like, the gray zones are way more eroded. So, like, thinking of TJ in this country, at least my approach, is not about thinking of extraordinary mechanisms. For sure, that's an important conversation, but it's thinking on how what a legal system or a justice system should provide, which is like basics, civic trust, recognition, reconciliation. They are not present. And that's what could pave the way to make the case on TJ, right? I'm happy to talk about how we are trying to elaborate on that on JTMX, but basically we are trying to provide technical assistance to local demands that are already happening. They are accountability demands in the country happening in this local context, but we need a better understanding of the root causes of what actually fuels violence in this country, which are like a multiplicity of actors. And second, at least, and that's probably my favorite pillar, I will focus particularly on institutional reform, right? We need an important conversation on how the use of violence has been translated from period to period, because there are specific people, the experts in violence, some authors call them, that pass on this knowledge. And we haven't had the chance of like breaking these chains of impunity and violence.
Wow, we could probably, the two of you, I could have done like 2 hours on each of this. I want to ask Jo Marie if you hear any sort of parallels with Guatemala, because I was trying to come up with some sort of a question that would say, what's the relationship between the efforts against anti-impunity efforts that look toward the past with the current investigations of corruption? Because you know that Guatemalan politicians have been pushing back. They push back against the SIG, they push back against prosecutors. So do you hear, when you listen to Jorge talk about Mexico, in this idea of like this, there really isn't a separation between economic violence and political violence in Guatemala. So could you say a little bit about that in terms of and also we can also bring in a little conversation about the institutions. I wanted to get into sort of the nitty gritty about the judicial system and sort of the local access to justice and the like. So it's a big, tall order, but how do you see this connecting?
I think there's like 5 questions there, Stephanie, but I'll try to
pick whichever one you would like to answer.
Yeah. So listening to Jorge, I thought, the first thing that came to my mind towards the end of his comments was that one of the main differences between Guatemala and Mexico is that there was, in fact, an armed conflict in Guatemala. There were armed insurgent movements that had risen up against a series of very brutal, very repressive military governments. There was a long drawn out process led by the United Nations to finally bring the parties to the negotiating table, the military kicking and screaming, obviously. And that eventually ended with the signing of peace accords, formal peace accords, in which the state of Guatemala promises to carry out a series of reforms. That's the non-recurrence part of TJ. Judicial reform, reform of the police, reform of the military, land reform, among reforms to acknowledge and be more inclusive of the indigenous population, which is a majority in Guatemala. So there is a very notable distinction between the Guatemalan case as a very clear, post-conflict society, and Mexico, which we have a hard time trying to define what it actually is. Is it post-authoritarian? Is it actually a conflict? There's no that, so there's that problem. But the idea that there's, I think that that ideally a transitional justice process represents a rupture, a break from the past towards the present. But we know that that's obviously often not the case. And especially in societies like Guatemala, neighboring El Salvador, Chile, where the military and elites retain a great deal of power, and the negotiation or the transition process is in fact a negotiated one. Those powers often remain and constrain the transitional justice process. That was the whole origins of the truth versus justice debate back in the 80s and 90s was, well, we can have truth, but it's really hard to have justice because Pinochet is right there, for example, in the case of Chile, or Rios Mon, he was just elected president of the Congress. So how are we going to have prosecutions in Guatemala? So these networks, even in places like Guatemala, where you had a formal peace agreement, those networks of very powerful individuals remain. And the fact that impunity persists allows some of these individuals to sort of morph into different networks of organized crime and corruption. And so there's a direct link in some of these cases. So if you looked at the Mulligan Tyson case, which I mentioned a moment ago, one of the individuals convicted in that case, Manuel Callejas y Callejas, was the G2, the head of military intelligence, between 1978 and 1982 during the Lucas Garcia regime. So he was convicted for his role as the intellectual author of Emma's detention, of the system that made possible her illegal detention, her torture, her rape, and then the disappearance of her brother. Now, this guy later on becomes like the head of an organized crime network known as the Cofradia, the Brotherhood, drug trafficking, money laundering, corruption at the aduanas, which he was head of for a while. You name it, he's involved in it. And he's also seen as very powerful politically. When he's arrested in 2016, El Periódico refers to him as the capo de capos, the kingpin of all kingpins in Guatemala. So here you see a direct connection between an individual who was responsible for some of the worst abuses during Guatemala's internal armed conflict and crimes that reach far into the present. And you know, why Guatemala or even the CC, when it was there, was never able to prosecute him for organized crime or whatnot. So it became a human rights trial. Interestingly, the U.S. withdrew his visa back in 2002 or 2003 because of allegations of his involvement in drug trafficking, and yet he continued in those positions of power for more than a decade beyond that. So that's just one example, I think, of how impunity stretches well into the present, even in cases like Guatemala, where you have had, a fairly robust, if incomplete and problematic transitional justice process. I don't know if you want me to talk about the reform of the justice system at this point. I don't want to.
Yeah, what I'm thinking is I'm gonna go back to Jorge to ask him about this also, because it makes me think like the conversations about the Mexican transition, right? It was a transition by election, right? It was the election of the first opposition party candidate to win, but it was also viewed as this is the moment when we're going to see the end of the PRI, but we know that that was not the case, right? So my question to you is, in going back to and connecting in with what Joe Marie said, is how do you see the impunity from the past connecting to the present? And when you talk about confronting it at the local level, who are the people that, is this the connection between former political elites who've maintained a certain kind of status and access to illegal or organized crime? How is that? How do you see that, or is that a mischaracterization of that?
I mean, that's a great question. Think it this way: TJ at the beginning, at the core, was about, and Joe Marie has mentioned it, justice performing in times of transition, how to make the way for justice in a really complex context, right? Either authoritarian regimes or either conflict regimes or post-conflict situations. So you actually have the main idea was about, and Professor de Graaf uses this phrase always, TJ was born out of practice, right? It was more about thinking on how to make the way for justice. So thinking on the connections, at least what evidence has shown, there's a strong connection between the failure of doing justice in the Mexican democratic transition and what we had in terms of the war on drugs. And if you think it in a time frame way, there was only a 6 years difference, right, between 2000 and 2006. It's not a lot, right? And I always have a hard time trying to many of the discussions on Mexico go on this, right? You need extraordinary mechanisms. You need to adopt a truth commission. And probably for me, that's not the main question. You need to go back to the basics and trying to understand what are the causes that gave you this situation. It is always repeated as a mantra, but I do believe in it. TJ is deeply and richly rooted in context. So you need to understand the context. Like when you grasp with the fact that context inform the type of intervention you're pushing for, you realize, okay, probably this is not the time for a truth commission in Mexico, because there are a lot of security concerns given there is an ongoing violent situation happening where a lot of people could be put at risk. And I'm not saying that in other situations it's not the same. There's always a risk security problem or situation. But the thing is that given the multiplicity of actors that you have, like perpetrating violence, like in who could you trust, right? on a basic level. So talking about like the local context, what you had at the end of the day was like pre-regime was, and I'm not like doing this rooting for pre, but I'm saying like in its own way was really perfect on how they uphold power. It was, you only, if you want to deal with someone, you only need to deal with pre. In the local, in the municipalities, in the federal level, right? And there were like really strongholds, like local strongholds, but at the end, it was all going from bottom to top to pre. When the democratization started in the country, which started locally, and there is a lot of studies on that, like how democratization can actually worsen the security situation. That's what actually could have happened in Mexico. There's some evidence indicating that, like the competitiveness in the democratic race in the local level create a fragmentation of actors. So you have to deal with many actors. You have to deal with PAD, you have to deal with PRI, you have to deal with PRD. So the security experts, the ones that were running the Office of Attorney General, the local security, those were the ones that were actually remaining in power. So the moment you change them, there was a lot of flux, right? And that was probably the moment where violence started to increase. But my point is like the constants, and this could go back to the last century and the beginning of the last century, has been violence has been able and a resource to be used by private actors, by public actors. Violence has been key, right? But the moment is like, as you mentioned, like you need a breaking point, right? You need a point that a breaking point that says, hey, we need to try these people. We need a truth commission. My point in Mexico, and that's interesting, and that, believe it or not, makes more the case for TJ in this country, is like, who would you put on trial, right? For me, it's the system. It's a political system we developed. And I'm not saying that there is no particular persons that are responsible for atrocities. They are, for sure. And we need to prosecute it. But there is a more important conversation that we need to understand on how you can actually unfold the system that has been working for the last hundreds of years, because these are the remnants of PRI in a competitive fashion with many other political parties. So probably we call them in the project we're doing in Nayarit, we're trying to document like the numbers of violence. Like you have a lot of lethal violence, you have 4 disappearances, you have torture. It's like we have what we call the goteo effect, right? Like a drop falling and falling, like a person was killed, 2 persons were killed, 3 persons were killed, 4 or 5, and then, but you don't have like big massacres. You have some of them. But when you're trying to make sense of them, you find that like extortion is king in these particular places, right? And the most important constant is not lethal violence, which is for sure like a gross human rights violation, but how can you take away these small regimes of governance being ruling in these particular local situations? And that's for me like the most important discussion in terms of like, do we want to talk about TJ in this country? Sure, it cannot come only from the federal government, because the federal government will say what they actually say today. Like, we bear no responsibility in the killing of these local journalists. And it's easy to say that. But when you forget the other responsibilities you have, like in terms of international human rights law, like guaranteeing like regular conditions to exercise rights, that's the problem when you enter to this small context where there is no possibility of exercising human rights or exercising a demand for accountability. So probably the most important thing, at least to my mind, is we need to give oxygen to these local demands that are already happening. They are like really important ones. Some say like what's happening with the mothers looking for their loved ones. They have their own agenda. They're searching for the people they love. That's natural. Like justice could come later on. And that's not because there is no interest in justice, just because there are some priorities. And I think that makes sense, right? But at the same time, like this important, like this moral reserve that is actually fighting in the country, like trying to make sense of what's actually happening. Those are the ones that are the important parts, like to give them oxygen to being able to exercise human rights. And at least that's like my take on how to build TJ in the Mexican situation.
And it's so challenging, right? And partly because, you know, I mean, I'm interested also in knowing like what kind of public support is there for this kind of work. And in some ways, easy for me to sort of ask about the national level, but really what you're saying is that it's about the local level. It's about local communities. And the question is, are the people that are looking for justice at the very local micro level also facing either indifference or even antagonism? People don't want to shake this up because people are implicated. If you say extortion is king, it means that there are people who have accepted or have been forced to accept the way the system works and have worked within the system. So I think that's as somebody who's working with local actors, what's the what's that dynamic like? What kinds of things are these groups? I mean, do they have support of their communities?
I mean, that's a complex question because on the one hand, one of the big achievements of the human rights movement and actually the institutional reforms that have been passed come from actually the victims, right? The mothers looked for their loved ones, started to galvanize a movement, like a really important one. And they were the ones, of course, with some civil society organizations and UN, et cetera, but like at its core, it was the victims who pushed for actually, you should pass a specific law on enforced disappearances because we need a really strong framework to fight this, right? It's crazy to think that the legal system, like a so-called regular ordinary legal system, has entrenched and some type of extraordinary mechanism spinning around this ordinary type system, right? Like is even acknowledging in law that you have this problem. So that's a huge victory. And that was on the side of people that were actually searching for their loved ones. On the other hand, I think this regime or way of things being done in the country, which are way more back than the war on drugs, but even the war on drugs, it has been like a protracted conflict, 15 years. That's a lot, right? So there is, of course, a normalization on the discourse, on the legal level, on the political level. So I cannot find the word in English, but in Spanish it would be la evitación, which is like what the particular role of this type of violence is that breaks the ties between the members of a community, right? So it's really hard to build and protect the civic space. When we started to work in Nayarit, and this will sound logical for you, but for me it wasn't at the beginning. We say, okay, let's document a lot. We work with a grassroots movement that started to document corruption, Truth Commission in Nayarit, and they called themselves Truth Commission, which was astonishing, at least for me, right? A civic movement, like a citizens calling themselves, we are a Truth Commission. And truth could be produced, right, by citizens. There is no only like official. So the interesting part is that they tried and they successfully prosecuted many corruption cases from a past regime. They documented like 2,000 testimonies and put on trial like 30 people. That's a lot coming from a citizen movement, right? But the important part was that they galvanized a movement rooted on the idea of stop corruption, stop abusing. And if you go to other TJ experiences, this has also galvanized other claims rooted on rights, right? You have Tunisia, you have Kenya, So probably the point of entry is, at least to my mind, and the work we do on JTMX is to, and my partner who is watching this probably will disagree, like it's not about, like, the cause shouldn't be about calling it TJ. It's more about calling it the chance to exercise rights and rooted on a justice perspective. Like, justice has been so absent, like even in the metric of Latin America, that you need to galvanize a movement that claims for justice and claims for exercising rights, because they are being denied in this particular local context. So I'm not saying that the federal government has no role, it has a lot. But at the end, it's more about governance, like how you build governance in these particular regimes. And that's why I think, like, the Mexican case could pose like a quantic leap in terms of how we are understanding TJ. But if you go to the basics, I think that there are some constants that you can find.
That's absolutely fascinating, and I'm going to bring in Jo Maria in a second, but I also want to encourage everyone. We're all riveted by the analysis of our guest speakers. But if you have any questions, please don't be shy. Put them into the chat, into the Ask the Marxe Q&A. I know that Professor Arias has some questions coming up. But to finish this off, I want to ask before I allow him to ask his question. I want to ask Jo Maria, this question about Guatemala in terms of access to justice. There have been reforms, like in, as you're talking about in Mexico, the reforms at the top, but I'm assuming there's also been action from the local level, right? That it's been very victim driven. You're even writing a book about victim centered transitional justice and the importance of the voice of victims. So what's the experience of Guatemala in that?
Thanks, Stephanie. Well, it's interesting because Guatemala had a very important international role in the transformation of its justice sector. That's not to say it was only or primarily driven by the international community and primarily by the United Nations, because there were also very local demands and changes within the local justice systems that have been important. But, starting with the peace accords, the role of the UN, then you had MINUGUA, a mission that was stationed in Guatemala for many years, sort of oversee the implementation of the peace accord measures, even though many of them were not in fact implemented, right? And then in 2007, you had this very unprecedented body, the International Commission Against Impunity in Guatemala, which was brought in on the initiative of civil society, precisely because in the post-war period, this is 10 years after the end of the conflict, Guatemala was descending into a spiral of violence, criminal violence, drug violence, other forms of violence, and organized crime that were untenable. And so that generated this very unprecedented intervention where the UN sends this commission they set up office in Guatemala, and their job is to work side by side with the Attorney General's office and with the judiciary to reform the system and to investigate cases of organized crime and corruption. They're not empowered to investigate crimes from the past, although that was part of civil society's original proposal, but the Congress had to sign off on getting CICIG approved, and so that was taken off the table, interestingly. But at the same time, the reforms that the CICIG helped usher through and helped sustain the sort of the local impetus for reform that it helped also sustain, did provide sort of cover for these human rights prosecutions to move forward in Guatemala. So just to give a couple examples, in 2009 or 10, someone who was, very known for corruption was appointed to be Attorney General. And the then head of the CICIG at the time, Carlos Castristana, the prosecutor in the Pinochet case back in Spain, he called out the government for the naming of this person and said, I resign because this is untenable. And the government was forced to backstep, and they held a new process to name a new prosecutor. And in that prosecutor, we get Claudia Paz y Paz, who is someone from civil society who then really makes a commitment as Attorney General to address impunity in Guatemala. For crimes of the present, but also for crimes of the past. And that's really what gives impetus to these transitional justice prosecutions in Guatemala. But at the same time, there are really important changes going on at the judiciary. Again, some of which is promoted from within by independent, forward-thinking magistrates and judges like Cesar Barrientos. And some of which are supported by CC. And the most important thing in my mind was the creation of the high-risk court system, which was designed to deal with some of these high, grand corruption, organized crime cases, but also became the site for almost all of the human rights cases that we're talking about in Guatemala. So you have judges who are better trained, better prepared, know about human rights law, international human rights law, who are granted better protection. The cases are concentrated in Guatemala because precisely the courts locally are still, as Jorge is suggesting, deeply flawed, deeply corrupt, deeply indelible to external influence. And there's a case, there was another conviction in Guatemala in February that I'll just mention that highlights this. In 2014, a former military commissioner was arrested, put on trial, and absolved of the forced disappearance of 3 individuals. And it turns out his daughter was a major drug trafficker, and she was many years later convicted by CICIG and the Guatemalan Attorney General's office, and she was sentenced on 2 different counts. So he went free because there was all this intimidation, presumably one imagines, by people connected to his daughter. He was the sentence was revoked. The acquittal was revoked years later, and he was rearrested last year, put on trial, and now the case. And I should have mentioned that case took place in a local court. I'm trying to remember where, in Tactic, which I think it's Alta Verapaz. I have to confirm. But so now, when he's rearrested last year, that case goes to a high-risk court. And it's a completely different process. And he's convicted. He was convicted a few weeks ago. So there's, these high-risk courts provide, an alternative, and they're part of the Guatemalan justice system, but they are a little bit of an island as well. So there is that problem. It's not a perfect system. And, the high-risk court, so there are some high-risk court judges whose decisions have been highly questioned. You remember I mentioned that the charges in the Maya Echi case were dismissed by the pretrial judge. That was a high-risk court judge who dismissed, did not abide by international practices. She just simply dismissed, didn't even consider really the testimony of the victims, the survivors. So, there's this, it's a very tense, contentious play between the local, which remains, I think, deeply problematic in Guatemala, and the national level prosecutor's office and the national level high-risk court systems that have allowed some things to move forward in Guatemala. Guatemala is not like Mexico. It's not a federal system, and yet you still have these very deep problems with local level prosecutor. And I could give you umpteen more examples of that, but I don't want to abuse my time.
So we have a question from Lindsay McCormack. She asked both Jo Marie and Jorge, I would love to hear their thoughts about the potential impact limitations of investor activism to support local transitional justice advocates, especially in influencing the behaviors of international corporations. And I guess since Jo Marie just talked, I'll put this first to Jorge.
Sorry, could you repeat the question? I didn't catch it that
yes.
well.
She would like to hear more about your thoughts about the potential impact limitations of investor activism to support local transitional justice advocates, especially in influencing the behaviors of international corporations?
Thanks. That's a good question. Like, first of all, in the last years, there has been like a movement or train of thought to push for local agendas, right? Like this is one of the claims against TJ. Like it's really based on a bureaucratic approach, like technocratic approach, and forgetting about the local struggles that are happening. On the other hand, there are other criticism in terms of like local justice, like notwithstanding that is a good approach, at the end of the day, it could have it could bring the risk of not being that effective, right? Like it's better to focus on a national level, on a federal movement, rather than local interventions. In Mexico, what has been discussed on the one hand is that, and since it's a federal state, right, and they have like many different regions and many different, like the dynamics within the country are like really different among them. So that makes the case probably for using a local approach. In terms of corporations, like that's a hard question. Like there is also like this increasing of the agenda of TJ, right? Like we're focusing more on the role of corporations and corporate accountability. And I think Jo-Marie has written actually a lot on that regard. But in terms of like the role corporations could be playing in Mexico, you have now, for example, there is a huge trial going on actually in the United States, where the Mexican federal government sued the gun companies, like gun producing companies, because they have apparently, that's certain, they have a role in how arms are being entering to the country. And I mean, I don't want to go into the details in the legalistic approach and standing of the Mexican government to bring a claim in the United States, but at least there is some interest in moving forward the conversation, right? Like saying like, hey, we have a shared responsibility. This is not only about the states. On the one hand, I do agree with the idea that we need to expand how we're thinking of justice in general terms, right? And that's one of the questions I always ask to one of my classes in Coahuila to victims or relatives or people that have been disappeared. Is like, what are your thoughts on justice? Like, what's the type of justice you are pursuing, right? So this is important in the sense of like, we need to broaden the conversation in terms of like, who are other actors involved in these situations? And I think it will change depending on the context. But I don't know if like I'm actually answering the particular question or just like going around. So I will pass the microphone to Jo-Marie.
Thanks, Jorge. So, I mean, I would say the following. In 2013, when Guatemala was prosecuting the dictator Rios Montt, the former head of state, who, as I mentioned, had been then a member of Congress since essentially the end of the peace agreements until he stepped down in 2011, which is what allowed him to finally be charged. You start to see this incredible backlash. When the trials before Rios Montt were focusing on essentially the foot soldiers, maybe the civil defense patrol members, men from local communities have been forcibly forced to join these civil defense patrols by the military. No one really cared. But when they started touching people like Rios Montt and other senior officials, there starts to be this massive backlash. And who is behind this massive backlash? In part, it's the old guard military, but it's also economic elites who were deeply involved in the counterinsurgency war. And there's some indication that there were some plantations were used as detention centers and torture centers. Wealthy landowners helped pay for military helicopters and so on and so forth. So there's a deep connection there between the kind of counterinsurgency the military was waging and the economic interests of the Guatemalan elite. And so when Rios Montt was convicted, it's no surprise that the business association, the CACIF, the next day holds a press conference and calls on the constitutional court to overturn the verdict, which it doesn't actually overturn the verdict. It essentially suspends the proceedings sort of midway through, literally not even acknowledging that there had been a verdict, throwing the whole thing into turmoil, right? And so it's those elites who are then activated, right? Because, and there's a great report in Plaza Publi that came out about this. Rios Montt's daughter, Suri Rios, who will run for president in the next elections, mind you, she tried to run last year, but she was prevented from running. She apparently sat down with the CACIF and said, if you don't stop this, they're coming for you next because you all helped pay for this. So there is a direct connection between economic elites and the kind of violence that was deployed in the Guatemalan civil conflict. So what role can investor activism play? I'm not exactly clear in terms of the past, but I think there is a role for looking at the role of economic elites in sustaining human rights abuses in their role. But there is a role in investor activism today in Guatemala. I mean, right now, the Guatemalan jungle is being completely deforested and replaced by palm plantations for palm oil, for mining, and there's numerous reports in the press about these dynamics, some of which are, our international corporations are involved, Guatemalan elites are involved, and there could be some activism, there should be, and there is, I think, activism around that. So I think there's these two dimensions of that one could look at in the Guatemalan context. But I just want to just point out that I think Jorge's comment that TJ early on was not really thinking about these issues of the role of economic elites, of corporations, and that has really opened up. I mean, Argentina has had a few prosecutions of economic, in the case of corporations, the case of the Ford Motor Company, some executives were convicted for their direct role in human rights abuses. Colombia has also pursued some cases. But most other countries that have engaged in TJ, this is not advanced very far. So it is definitely sort of an area to explore much more deeply, I think, in all the countries where you've seen gross human rights violations. Thanks.
So we have another question from Jonathan Alarcon. And this one, I think, probably goes a little bit more towards Jo Marie, but might also apply to Jorge in the context of the war on drugs. Jonathan writes, during the beginning of the Guatemalan Civil War, based on CIA declassified intelligence documents, the CIA trained Guatemalan security forces, which killed and raped thousands of indigenous people. Years later, the US government gave $33 million in military aid to continue to fight leftist guerrillas and villagers who aided them. Should Guatemalan judicial institutions, or I might reframe this slightly to say, Guatemalan Transitional Justice, seek to hold the US accountable, especially with regard to economic reparations compensation?
That is a great question. Thank you for that question. So it's interesting. Let me just step back a minute and note that when the Salvadoran Truth Commission produced its report, no mention was made of the role of the United States in supporting and training, and providing weapons and et cetera to the Salvadoran military, which committed massive and gross human rights abuses during that civil conflict. The Guatemalan Truth Commission, the official Guatemalan Truth Commission, the one run by the UN, the Commission for Historical Clarification, sort of learned from that what I think many people see as a mistake. And they included a whole discussion, analysis of the role the United States played, starting from the 1954 CIA-sponsored coup against the democratically elected government of Jacobo Arbenz, and then the role that it played in sustaining these very brutal military governments for the next several decades, including training and so forth. With a brief interregnum under the Carter administration, which was then immediately restarted under Ronald Reagan. And if you know anything about that history, you know that Ronald Reagan embraced Rios Montt, claimed he had gotten a bum rap on human rights, and immediately reinitiated U.S. assistance to Guatemala. So the U.S. has a lot to answer for in Guatemala. It's important to note the U.S. government under Bill Clinton did apologize for its role in the Guatemalan conflict. Shortly after the Truth Commission report came out, I believe, is when that happened. And there is an ongoing program of assistance to Guatemala, and they've just ramped it up. But could there be more? Yes, I believe there could be. There could be a lot more in the way of reparations support for transitional justice measures. The reparations program in Guatemala is virtually dead. There was a robust reparations program at one point that the last three governments have simply starved of funds and have just literally shut down. So the U.S. could play a much more vigorous role in that way, sort of to atone for its past. There's a whole question of could there be accountability? Obviously, you'd have to get someone from the United States extradited to be prosecuted in Guatemala. We all know, and because of the way power politics work, that's never going to happen. But that's not to say they're not vulnerable, right? Universal jurisdiction and all those other mechanisms are around and could be applied at some point. But I think for now, the Guatemalan courts are focused on holding Guatemalan perpetrators accountable. It's also interesting, in the Molina Tyson trial and the genocide trial, in which Lucas Garcia, the former head of the army, is on trial in both of those cases. He often referred to the role of the U.S. And kind of actually tried to blame the United States. We were just following what the U.S. told us to do, which, well, yes and no. You were enmeshed in this broader, Cold War system, and you were trained by the United States and so on and so forth. But you also carried out these acts quite on your own. So I think the effort to prosecute in Guatemala those responsible for some of the worst abuses, I think is very important, aside from the fact that there are many U.S. officials who could potentially be held responsible, but most likely never will be.
Thank you, Jo Marie. Jorge, did you have anything you wanted to add to that, particularly with regards to maybe how the war on drugs might be implicated, might implicate the U.S. in some of the violence in Mexico?
Yeah, I mean, that's a great question, even for the Mexican side. Like the U.S. government, across its many agencies, has played a huge role in Mexican politics, right? It's not the same of talking about DEA or FBI, because they also have their own codes and their own even subject matter jurisdiction. So when you talk about the U.S., you also have to go a bit deeper and try to understand, okay, of whom agency am I actually talking? Certainly, even the inception of the drug prohibition regime was actually furthered by the United States, right? This had a huge influence in Mexico's historic efforts to try to look for alternatives, like less aggressive in terms of how to regulate drugs in the country, right? But even if you go to the particular time of the war on drugs, the US involvement has been huge in terms of intelligence sharing, like training, funding, like the Merida Initiative has which was signed, I think, in 2005 or 2006, like with Calderon, with Presidente Calderon, who launched the war on drugs. Was a huge income for the Mexican government in terms of financing its war on drugs, right? But if you go into the complexities of the Mexico-US relationship, you will find that now the Mexican government is trying to change that understanding. They actually they're replacing the Merida Initiative for a different framework that is supposed to be more horizontal, let's see. But at the end, you cannot forget that, I mean, we are the neighbors of the United States, right? And we're not going to change that anytime soon. So at the end, the influences the United States plays in our domestic politics is huge. And the US interests play a huge role in terms of how Mexico even prosecutes people, right? There is a huge area of opportunity, I think, and so many countries have, I think, done it before. And Jo Marie mentioned it. She was referring to universal jurisdiction in particular, but like there are some cases of some other contexts that have been tried in the United States, trying to use, I think it's the torture, the city, no, I can't remember the name of the particular statute, but it's a sort of universal jurisdiction on the basis of torture, basically, and the United States cannot serve as a safe haven for perpetrators, and it's like trying to find like legal standing in the United States courts for abuses committed in different countries. So if you see Mexico, like that, we have an important policy of extradition, of sending people to the United States that are being wanted for drug-related crimes. So if you go through the records, and this is amazing in not a really good way, you will see that there is this like conspiracy to introduce drugs to the United States on trial, right? And the whole trial is about it. And then just an accessory matter, like the atrocities, the human rights abuses, the killings, are being mentioned, but not adjudicated in the United States. And of course, there are legal reasons for that, right? That the United States could claim, I have an interest on drugs entering to my territory. What is happening in Mexico, it's Mexican problem. But my question, like my follow-up question would be like, we're actually thinking of this, but probably we need more brains on strategies. Like, is there any way of pushing for a US interest in US courts, saying like, hey, there are killings being committed, but probably you have like perpetrators that are nationals from the United States, right? Or you have victims from the United States, right? Or even you have like economic losses from corporations, actually talking about corporations that are based in Mexico, but they are like US legal entities. So there's a huge area of opportunity there to explore, like in a sort of boomerang effect, like given the interest in the United States in Mexico's role in terms of the drugs regime, can we see for a window of opportunity in the United States, appealing to their interests in terms of prosecuting the abuses that are happening in the country? And I mean, there are many organizations working on that in different capacities, but I think there's a huge area to explore there in terms of the Mexico-US relation.
So I wanted to reframe or shift the focus of this a little bit. Both of you have talked about the complexity of drugs and ongoing impunity and violence. Another country that has dealt with drugs and impunity, but has also attempted transitional justice initiatives is Colombia. And I wonder if, in the context of Mexico and Guatemala, what lessons or warnings Colombia might offer of the use of transitional justice to address ongoing criminal violence, micro-level regimes of violence, and the drug trade amid a broader ongoing context of conflict in the country. So I'll start with Jorge and then go to Jo Marie with this question.
I mean, there has been a huge excitement on TJ interventions, right? On TJ initiatives and the relative success they have achieved, right? When we evaluate TJ, we sometimes tend to think of a full compliance of justice level to compare it to what's actually happening. But to be honest, let's be honest, like the point of entry is like a scenario of impunity. Like there's nothing happening. So TJ could and has paved the way for justice initiatives to happen and actually to give space for the claims of victims to actually attain justice. This is imperfect, for sure. We have to face it. Right? There's a huge paradox on how we label justice or transitional justice as justice with a capital letter. Like, is this justice at the end of the day? And that's an important discussion we need to have. On terms of exporting, let me use that word, the TJ understanding for different contexts, and probably, yeah, Colombia offers good guidance. Tunisia also offers good guidance. El Salvador offers also good guidance, but I think that's part of a bigger trend in terms of like the evolution. How are we understanding like these justice claims, right? They were more narrow, I would say, at the beginning, like when TJ was being thought about, and even CONADE, the National Commission for the Search for Disappeared in Argentina, if you see their mandate, it's like really, really narrow, right? There's like three small points, and then there you go. Like, and then if you see the evolution of the mandates of truth commissions, now they are being asked to even reconcile this particular country, and this is just like, what are we expecting from TJ mechanism? And I think we have to be really careful there and really realistic. Like, TJ is part of a bigger probably agenda on development and rule of law, but it's not only that. It doesn't cover the whole agenda, and we have to be really realistic on that. At least to my mind, the use and exportation of TJ in context of like criminal governance, of fragility, state capture, and on the one hand, they respond to what we're seeing in many different countries, not only in Mexico. Like today, many of the murders that are taking place in the world like the numbers are coming from this type of context rather than like core strict conflict. So we need to think about it. I'm not saying that just because of this fact, TJ should be implemented in this context. It doesn't work that way. But at the end of the day, I think it could open the conversation to think in two main aspects: justice and governance. Like, to what type of justice are we willing to commit ourselves, and what do we want in terms of governance and enjoy of rights in our particular countries? Like, I have always this discussion with many colleagues in Mexico, like, let's forget for a moment of extraordinary mechanisms. This discussion will come later, and it's not about us, it's about the victims and what they want. We will not decide what the mandate of the Truth Commission. We can advise, but that's on the part of the demands and the victims. And the victims, the most important part is to, let's say, challenge this marginalization that has taken place for many years and bring them back to the discussion. Like, there was an important discussion in Mexico 1 year ago, and let me finish with that. The president launched a referendum to ask people like, whether should we try the former presidents of Mexico for corruption and abuses, right? And some people say like, hey, you are putting human rights to being consulted, to being subject to a referendum. You shouldn't do that, right? But this galvanized a huge discussion with people that were outside the system that say like, this is a better chance for me. Like, I have never had a chance of being asked like whether I want justice because it has been denied the whole time. Like, even to flipping a coin is a better opportunity. And that was like just heartbreaking for me, like listening like many people that are out of the system. And for sure, like, as Jo-Marie correctly mentioned, like the role of the elites. Many of the elites were saying like justice is not under consultation. Yeah, because it has never been denied to you. So that's probably the main discussion we need to have. Like, TJ, leaving aside the discussion between justice and fraud and the complexities and the tensions, like, and believe me, I'm all in for legal theory because that's my area of expertise. But at the end of the day, I think it's more about like galvanizing conversations on justice. Like, it sounds like pretty like a fairy tale, but at least that's probably the cascade some say that just transitional justice initiatives and demands open. Like, the opportunity to talk about like of citizens in the same level, like in an horizontal level, to talk about justice and rights. So probably that's my take on exporting TJ to non-traditional contexts.
And just to give Jo-Marie a last opportunity to respond, I also wanted to build on a question that Tanya Leon asked. which was about a history of distrust in Mexico. And I actually wanted to kind of shift that question around a little bit and not only ask Jo Marie to respond to the question of Colombia, and its applicability to Guatemala, if relevant, but also to address the question of the role of transitional justice in helping rebuild trust in societies where there's a long-term deficit of trust due to their histories of violence.
Thanks, Desmond. I wanted to say in response to everything that Jorge said sounds like fantastic to me. I really agree with the way you framed it, Jorge. The idea of justice and governance as being sort of the two pillars of TJ, I think that's really important. And I also want to pick up on your idea of the role of victims, and I think it connects with the question that Desmond just asked. You know, one of the early discussions around transitional justice was about truth commissions are better, quote unquote, than trials because they center the victim. They're victim centered. It's not focused on a litigious process. It's not focused on the perpetrator. It's focused on the victim. I think we've sort of gone beyond that kind of dichotomous thinking to understand that trials can also be victim centered. And I think that's the important lesson from the successes of Guatemala, of places like Peru, Argentina, is that when you put victims at the center, whether you're talking about a truth commission, a trial, a reparations process, a commemoration, or a museum, or anything of that nature, when you put the victims at the center and include victims, include their voices, include their opinions, the outcome is going to be better. Now, it's obviously very difficult to do this because oftentimes, as we've already discussed, we have transitional situations in which the governments in power are not necessarily they don't necessarily take very kindly to transitional justice. They're not necessarily very interested in transitional justice processes. Oftentimes, transitional justice processes are the result of civil society and the international community, with the international community support, mobilizing and demanding. It's often rare, it's actually quite rare that the government is the one sort of just handing over transitional justice. It doesn't really work that way. The transitional government, just to give an example, the transitional government in Peru, they didn't really want a truth commission. It was only because civil society kept demanding and pressuring that they finally agreed to have a truth commission. So without the voice and the mobilizational capacity of civil society, these things aren't going to work. And unless you have, real participation and involvement on civil society's part, the outcome is likely to be suboptimal. And so I just want to, help us think about how we can be more effective in making sure that truth commissions, trials, all these different mechanisms are truly, in fact, not only victim-centered, but they listen to victims. They incorporate the opinions of victims. They incorporate the participation of victims. That's the only way to assure that these things actually are meaningful in the long term. And I'll end there.
Well, thank you so much for that response. I wanted to thank our panelists for their wonderful and thoughtful contributions, Jorge and Jo Marie. Thank you so much. I also wanted to thank Diana Lazov, Jonathan Alarcon, and Andrea Hundley at the Marxe School for their support, for their technical support for the event. I wanted to thank Nancy Aries, our interim dean, for her support of the speaking series over the year. I wanted to thank Stephanie Golub for her moderation and wonderful questions, and also ISLA and the Weissman School for their support for the event. I hope we are able to collaborate again in the future. And I wanted to point the guests here to the chat, where there is both a survey you can take to tell us what you'd like us to be doing for future events, and also an advertisement for the next Marxe talk on April 14th on illiberalism and its challenge to American liberal democracy. Thank you so much for your attention today, and have a good afternoon.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.